Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm really happy to introduce my friend and longtime collaborator, Dr. Christopher Chartier, Associate Professor of Psychology at Ashland University and founder of the Psychological Science Accelerator, which is a multinational network of about 1,400 research labs from about 70 countries engaging in big team open science projects. On a personal level, one of the things that I value most about Dr. Chartier is that throughout his commitment to improving the rigor of psychological research, he's maintained a commitment to kindness and collaboration. So without further ado, here's Dr. Chartier talking about psychology's reform movement and the launch of the Psychological Science Accelerator. Take it away.
Cool. Thank you so much. I also go by Chris, so if anybody wants to just chime in and call me Chris, that's fine. But yeah, thanks for the warm welcome and for the opportunity to talk to this group of students and then other members of the campus community in a little bit here during the second talk. I designed the talk today to kind of be maybe like a sweeping overview of some issues in open science and maybe the reform movement more generally, but to focus in also on the Psychological Science Accelerator. But I've also tried to build in quite a bit of time for student questions. I see there's a good number of you here. I'm all excited to talk to you, students and non-students alike. And I really do welcome interruptions with questions, comments, or points that I can respond to in either the chat I'll be kind of monitoring or the Q&A, and some of the other panelists might alert me to questions over there. So I welcome them. I don't mind being interrupted. I kind of like typically an in-person format where we can just kind of chat as we go. So hopefully we can try to simulate that as best we can, even in the Zoom format. Okay, so my real cheesy title is Crisis for Opportunity ? Because I don't like to be a real doom and gloom guy when it comes to discussing science and the reform movement. And I really do try to take an optimistic kind of mindset towards the last, I don't know, decade plus of it's been a bit stormy in psychological science. I really do view this as a great opportunity to strengthen the field, to do good work, and then to maybe also influence other kind of cognate fields in the social sciences. Okay, but I have to start with a little doom and gloom. For us to go on a campaign of reform or improvement in the field, there's obviously some shortcomings or some imperfections in our science that kind of prompt that or call us to arms in that regard. For me, this whole kind of saga or chapter of my life really started in 2011. I was in grad school, and I can remember the Daryl Bem ESP paper kind of just like dropping a bomb into my world and the field. And essentially in a high profile published paper in JPSP, he supposedly found that people could essentially predict the future or predict future events in the lab. And he published a paper with a series of studies showing statistically significant patterns that suggested people had ESP. And of course, basically nobody believed it. It was the case that either everything we know about the universe and the flow of space-time was incorrect, or there was something amiss or interesting to kind of dig into in research practices or publication practices. And so most folks kind of landed on that side of the whole debate to try to investigate this. It wasn't just a one-off study though, of course. So if you've kind of done any amount of diving into this area of research, you know that the ESP paper was just kind of a spurring moment or kind of a seminal moment in this reckoning. But of course, there are other kind of larger data points that suggest that replication rates in psychology historically have been less than optimal, let's just say. There's room for improvement, essentially. So the Center for Open Science led a large replication effort that was published in 2015, attempting to replicate 100 published findings in psychological science. I was part of this project. We actually did 2 attempted replications here at Ashland, actually like just upstairs from where I'm sitting right now in our little lab space. And of those 100, only around 40 of them were what we would consider successful replication attempts, or cases where the finding was statistically significant and in line with the original published effect of the original study. And so, of course, that leaves around 60 of the study, 60%, where we didn't get a successful replication attempt. And so if every study in this 100-study replication effort were successfully replicated perfectly, we would expect all these dots to be blue, or this light blue, and we would expect them all to be on this diagonal line showing that the replication effect size would be equivalent to the original effect size. Of course, as you can see from a quick look at the figure, that was not the case. So that just kind of dovetails with what I was saying about the kind of cruder yes, no criterion for replication success or failure. So this rang some alarm bells for many of us and suggested there's probably a lot of room for improvement in our research practices and publication practices in psychological science. I'm not sure that our successful replication rate should be 100%. That might mean that we aren't trying crazy things or really pushing for new shocking discoveries as much as we should be, but probably it should be higher than 40 when we go looking. I think there's kind of consensus around that room for improvement idea. Another large problem that has been kind of spoken about quite a bit in recent decades, but has been really picking up some momentum in terms of there being real motivation or energy to tackle it, is this problem of homogeneous samples in psychological science. So this has been written about in a few different ways and kind of had a few different terms attached to this core problem. I kind of like calling it the college sophomore problem. Maybe at my institution, it's more like the college freshman problem. And it's just the observation that a large majority of the participants in published papers on psychological phenomena are drawn from convenience samples. So they're like, I teach Psych 101. I was just mentioning, I've got a couple sections of that this fall. Well, those are the participants on campus. And college freshmen in some ways are probably representative of all human beings, but in other ways, right, they're kind of a unique thin slice of all of humanity. I am different than I was when I was a college freshman, for example, and I think that's probably true of most of us. And first of all, you're drawing from a college sample to begin with there. Another common term used to kind of describe this problem more generally is this idea of weird samples, or the really influential paper just was titled The Weirdest People in the World. And it suggested that, again, if we look at most of the published findings in psychology, these samples are drawn from places that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. I think I got all 5 out of 5 correct there. And so the idea is that those folks are weird. They, again, are just a thin slice of humanity. And then another potential issue is that in our quest to maybe collect larger samples, which we're going to discuss later, has that just driven us to kind of quick and easy online platforms that, again, maybe don't represent psychological phenomena in a really complete, diverse, and representative way, such as on mTurk or Prolific or similar platforms. So those might not be kind of perfect fixes to getting more diverse and representative samples. So those are two kind of like joint problems, perhaps, in psychological science. And if we look at like kind of the larger research ecosystem, we can point to a lot of problems or specific things that might have led to those low replication rates, and might also relate to the homogeneous samples problem. Okay, so this is the like elementary school science fair perfect fairy tale version of science, the hypothetico-deductive model of science that we all initially learned, although maybe the terms were a little different or a little simpler. And I've got a second grader, my son, going through this kind of learning some basic early science, so it's fun to hear him kind of think through this. But the idea, right, is that you generate and create a specific hypothesis, design your study, you go out and do the study, conduct some data analysis and interpretation. And then I think when I was a kid, this was called like share with your friends. Maybe you go to the science fair or you publish the finding, and it's cyclical, it's iterative. We're always finding out more and designing new studies based on those findings. But I'm going to put some terms up here in red that suggest that we haven't quite been living up to this hypothetico-deductive model of science in psychology. Before we shift to, like I said, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but let me lay some foundations here. Often our theories are really vague or our hypotheses aren't very well specified. Like I just mentioned, we have these kind of narrow homogeneous samples. We often collect small samples, which mean that we don't have much statistical power. We'll talk about some problems in our data analysis where we may go searching for statistical significance or perhaps only pursuing the analyses that quote unquote work or show statistical significance when we analyze our results. Sometimes we change our hypotheses after we know the results. So we get this cool data set and we find out that men and women differ perhaps on some measure, and we write our paper as if that was always our prediction or always the case. And then finally, we tend to only publish the things that do quote unquote work or are statistically significant. If we're investigating something interesting and we see that an intervention has no impact or no measurable outcome, often we don't follow up and publish that so that other researchers can kind of know that that's maybe a blind alley or not very promising avenue to pursue. Okay, so now we'll get brighter for maybe kind of the remainder of this. But that was just kind of set some context and lay a foundation for some of the reforms and improvements. So kind of my entry point into what I call the reform movement is essentially this group called SIPS, the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. It's a really cool group. It started as an annual conference. I've been to several of them, where essentially people kind of start with the assumption that is science perfect today? No. What are some ways that we could improve it, and particularly in psychological science? And so the conference and the society is all built around getting to work on implementing improvements to the field that can make our samples more diverse and representative, but also make our work more replicable or reproducible so that we're generating lasting knowledge, which is our goal as scientists. I've also done quite a bit of work with a nonprofit out of Charlottesville, Virginia, called the Center for Open Science. Like I mentioned, they led that large replication effort. But there were these kind of big organizations pushing the field to do better that really kind of, like I said, were my entry point and continue to be kind of cool connection points for any students or researchers that are interested to get involved in this space. They're still really active groups doing excellent things. And some of the reforms that seem really promising and have already kind of gained some momentum really were born out of the work of these two organizations. So the Center for Open Science in particular was an early leader in trying to incentivize kind of getting back to that more idealized version of the hypothetico-deductive model of science, at least for like hypothesis-driven research. And they kind of fell back on the Royal Society's original motto, which is nullius in verba, which means take nobody's word for it, which sounds kind of menacing, but really just kind of suggests, hey, if somebody makes a scientific claim or argument or presents a result, we should be able to verify that essentially independently in some way. We don't just take somebody on their word in matters of science. That's kind of where that original motto comes from. I'm going to elaborate on that whole concept, I guess, in about an hour from now in my other presentation. But they push for the adoption of some practices and for almost giving like little gold star stickers on papers that followed certain practices or open science practices. One of them is to share data openly when it's ethical and reasonable to do so. So when folks can't be identified and when data isn't of a sensitive nature. Sharing materials so that others can see exactly what procedures, methodology, and instruments we use in our studies, ideally so they could carry out extensions or replications of that work. A big push has been to pre-register our hypotheses and our data analysis plans. And this is one way to prevent problems of p-hacking or flexible data analysis, but also hypothesizing after the results are known. So if we kind of lay a marker down and say we expect this study that we're conducting to turn out in a specific way, well, then we can directly compare our results to that pre-registered or that pre-committed analysis plan and hypothesis. So that's maybe kind of one partial alleviation of that. And then I've seen in the actually the Psychi Journal of Psychological Research, which is a great undergraduate research outlet, and I've had my students publish there. You can also earn a direct replication badge, trying to incentivize conducting more replications to, assess the robustness of findings in the published literature. So the idea with some of these interventions are, hey, here's some practices that enhance the openness and transparency of our scientific work. Let's try to build a culture of giving small incentives or pats on the back or supporting people in attempting to engage in some of these productive practices. So that's really been one of the things that the Center for Open Science has really pushed on and been a leader in. There's kind of mixed evidence in terms of how well simply like putting the sticker on there like really works. You also have to follow through with that and make sure that data are like well documented enough to actually be used. So there's still like a lot of problems. Like a little sticker doesn't solve all the problems, of course, but it's an interesting like low investment intervention early in kind of the open science and reform movement. That seems promising. I think probably more promising is a reform intervention that I've become just a complete and utter fanboy about. I think that it's just really revolutionary and it's an important way to change our publication practices, and it's called registered reports. A researcher named Chris Chambers has been really influential in promoting and working hard to get journals to switch to this type of publication pathway. So in a typical peer review system, when you go conduct your study and you want to get it published, which is like a big part of the incentive structure for any scientist, is to get publications, get lines on your CV. Okay, so here's a few of the key pieces of the hypothetico-deductive model of science kind of picked out here. Usually what we have happen is we go do the darn thing, and then we get peer review conducted so that we can get our reward, so that we can publish and get our line on our CV. That's kind of the traditional model. And that has problems. It might lead people to p-hack, to selectively report. That's where all the publication bias comes in, where only statistically significant things tend to be published. And so it kind of warps the incentives for scientists, and I think leads to a lot of problems in our research ecosystem. So with a registered report, the key kind of twist or intervention or change here is that you move the peer review much earlier in the process. So here we've got it kind of sliding up to like somewhere in the design phase. I like this a lot. It's like at the G in the word design, because with a registered report, you go design your study. You write a version of your paper without the results. So it's before you collect and analyze your data. And then you get sometimes multiple rounds of external expert peer review to see if your paper can be what's called accepted in principle. If that's what occurs, then you can proceed with the study with the assurance that the journal will publish the paper regardless of how the results turn out, as long as essentially you do a decent job and you do what you say you were going to do in the study. I like having the little arrow here on this little slider somewhere in the word design, though, because what's really cool about a registered report is, as a researcher, when I've been on the research side of this, I design a study. And Dr. Steltenpohl was just talking about her advanced research methods course, or the number 2, where you're actually conducting your study. Well, think back to the course where you were designing it. You got feedback from an expert, from Dr. Steltenpohl. So I'm sure you designed it, you submitted it, and then it probably got better, or it was streamlined or improved in that review process. Well, that also happens in registered reports. So it's really fun as a researcher, as a scientist, to design my studies, but then to get that expert external review before I do it. And it almost turns peer reviewers into like collaborators in an interesting and kind of weird but fun way, where they're constructively helping improve your study before you even go and conduct it. I've also had a lot of fun on the reviewer side. Registered reports are so much fun to review compared to something that's finished, the previous version, where you kind of like nitpick and maybe you're in the mindset of trying to find flaws. I don't know why I naturally kind of fall into that or used to fall into that with traditional peer review. But with registered reports, I find myself taking on a mindset of, hey, this is cool. How can it be better? And taking a more kind of collaborative and constructive approach. So I love it. And then you can put in all the work, the effort, the investments, knowing that you get the reward at the end of the process. So it takes some of that like dice roll out of publishing and getting our main scientific incentives. So I think it's a really critical reform that luckily is picking up quite a bit of momentum. Oh, cool. I promised I would look at the questions, and I've got a good one here from Callista. Hopefully, I hope I'm pronouncing that relatively well. Is a registered report an experiment? Yes and no. So a registered report is essentially the paper or the publication, the journal article that comes out reporting on a study. Typically, though, what you're reporting are the results of an experiment that you've designed and conducted. So yeah, you design the experiment, get your peer review feedback, conduct the experiment, and then publish the findings from that experiment. Hopefully I've answered that adequately and accurately. Cool, thank you. I almost reached over for a publication, and then I realized I've gotten rid of all paper versions. So all I have are books that I like over here. I used to have old copies of journal articles, and I was gonna hold one up, but I guess I have entered the modern system there. Okay, cool. Now I get to shift to talking about some of the stuff I've gotten to work on. So it's fun for me to lay the foundation and to celebrate the work of others, the really important reform movement work of others. But probably the reason I was invited is to talk about some of my own efforts in the reform movement, or some of the kind of constructive improvements I've tried to catalyze or work on or contribute my efforts to. So a lot of this, I know there's a kind of weird image here, but a lot of it started, there was a complete solar eclipse in the summer of 2017. So I don't know if people remember that. This was like I don't know. It left a lasting impression on me, partially because it was just kind of a cool, like, global event or celebration for humanity. Like, people got out, they got the glasses, and we knew exactly where the eclipse was going to track. And it kind of came through the Midwest. I think it came close to Ashland, so people drove out there to see it. And I had been thinking about some of these larger replication efforts and kind of ways to make some positive change in psychological science. And I was also just struck during the eclipse by just how cool and powerful it is to be able to make such precise predictions about a process that I'm sure at one time was extremely bewildering, confusing, and unpredictable. So predicting the movement of the celestial bodies, predicting eclipses down to the seconds is really just, it's fascinating and it's incredible. So I think the eclipse got me thinking in like real like pipe dream kind of mode, or just thinking about like big questions and big ways to kind of tackle improving psychological science. And I was also all fired up around the same time. I don't know if others remember this, but there was this big physics paper on gravitational waves, and it really got me motivated in a couple different directions. One was I was just in awe of this cool finding. Basically, they tracked down and were able to measure some of the first direct physical evidence in support of one of the main predictions of Einstein's theory of relativity, this concept of gravitational waves. So that was cool just in its own right, kind of similar to the eclipse, this amazing human endeavor and scientific finding that I find kind of moving or awe-inspiring. But the other thing that I really thought was cool about the gravitational waves paper is there were something like 1,100 authors. There were like 1,100 researchers and physicists that contributed to this one massive kind of field in humanities knowledge-changing result or paper. And I found that also inspiring on like a professional level, and thinking about how to organize researchers around a common goal. I think it was something like 10% of all PhD holding physicists were on this paper. And it just made me realize, wow, you can do pretty amazing things if you have some good coordination and organization, but also large numbers of people contributing their professional efforts to a scientific pursuit. So then I went on a really good long mountain bike ride, as I tend to do. And I was thinking about all these things. And I came out of that mountain bike ride with this idea that turned into a blog post, that turned into a tweet, that like kind of in a couple hour period, I recorded some audio memos, and then wrote this blog post that said it's time to begin building a quote unquote CERN for psychological science. CERN, this is like a nod to some of the particle physicists. And I was just basically in this, I was thinking out loud, but I was suggesting to the field that maybe we should try to pool our resources into some of these larger kind of team science projects a little bit more regularly. There were some big team science projects, but I thought there could be like a more organized or concerted effort. And in terms of like a nerd professor with like a couple hundred followers, it felt like it went viral, or I'll call it like academic viral, even though it's like so funny to me to look back and it's like 49 retweets. It's like of only like a moderately good dad joke will get hundreds of retweets. So it's not like big numbers in any kind of absolute sense, but in terms of scientists sharing an idea and signing on, there was a lot of momentum initially right away around this idea of building a CERN for psychological science. And so quickly we settled on a name, like there was a group kind of organizing around this, and we voted on the name of the Psychological Science Accelerator, not a CERN for psychological science, but accelerator still kind of has a nod, this little like allusion to physics. And there's a familiar name. Dr. Stelton Pohl, as you can see way back in the day in 2017, was one of the like early contributors to our Google Docs. She was in from almost day one. But there was a large community emerging of other like-minded folks like us kind of working on this idea or this project. So from the start, there were a few key elements that we thought were really important if we're going to build an accelerator, a CERN for psychological science, or do big team science psych projects in some partial response to the replication crisis. So here's our mission statement. It's kind of boring. It's just mission statement, organization, language. But people are going to volunteer their time and resources. We're going to select and then conduct really interesting psychological studies that we think are important. And we're going to use a democratic process to choose studies and kind of make key decisions. Pretty quickly, we had landed on 5 core principles that I think still do a pretty good job of guiding the direction of the PSA, even though I'm no longer all that actively involved as a founder. It's kind of cool to see these principles still really kind of being acted out day to day. So right off the top, foregrounding diversity and inclusion was central to the PSA. The idea is that we would want to be as inclusive and diverse as possible, not just in terms of the samples, like when we're talking about the weird samples problem and how to improve that, but also in terms of the researchers involved. We thought it was important to get as many voices heard as possible in every step of the process. The network from the start was to be decentralized, meaning there's a lot of like network feedback at key decision points in conducting our experiments. And most decisions are made by committees or groups, rarely is like a single leader kind of making critical decisions. And then we also wanted to build in some nods to kind of the open science ethos and approach. So we wanted to be transparent, both in the studies we conducted, but also how we did our work, but also rigorous and adhere to best practices and open ourselves up to criticism. So it's kind of cool. I'm going to talk through some specific studies, but right from the start, we wanted these 5 things to be really central to the PSA. And it's really nice to be able to look back at these when you're making small day-to-day decisions. It's been good to have some kind of guiding core principles. Okay. So I pulled up some August numbers. Dr. Stelton Pohl was quoting more recent numbers than I even included in my own talk, so my apologies. But the last, I think, actual official published map on the PSA website, all the green dots are individual institutions that now join these collective projects and collaborate on PSA activities. Well over 1,000 researchers are now in the network, representing around 80 countries. So we have a cool amount of global representation, but you can see the major problems that still remain, or the holes that remain. I guess not surprisingly, where are we heavily represented? Kind of those same places we were talking about with the weird samples problem. So North America and largely Western Europe. So by no means has the PSA just completely surmounted these issues by having a relatively large international network, but there is, a promising amount of global representation, and we're always trying to work to connect with more collaborators in the global South, essentially, where we kind of see less density on the map and less involvement in our studies, which also means less representation in our studies and in our samples. But it's still, I think it's there's reason for optimism there. It's kind of a promising map in my view. So here's what we actually do. One of the cool elements that was from the beginning and continues in the current PSA activities is that the leadership of the PSA, of the network, doesn't propose and then lead the studies. Instead, we accept and they accept submissions from anyone. And those submissions are then masked so that hopefully, like, the name recognition and prestige of the people proposing studies doesn't matter in the selection process, but we get peer reviewers and network votes on all these submissions. So anyone can propose a study to the PSA. There are these public calls. And so we get ideas from all over the place, all sorts of people and researchers at lots of different career stages, which is really kind of fun and interesting. The PSA then picks those that are kind of most worthy of our collective resources and investment, and then gets down to business on a lot of hard, messy, slow, long-term work. So I want to highlight a few of these things. When we're in the methodological phase, we have to finalize a protocol, or what we actually do in the experiment. That's kind of the obvious piece. Of course, you have to design the study and get ready to implement a psychological experiment, but there are a lot of other kind of sticky issues that are challenging and continue to be, hurdles for every PSA study. One is that we have to figure out who to give authorship to. Like I was saying on this physics paper, you've got hundreds, maybe thousands of people contributing, and you have to figure out who deserves authorship and how we figure out authorship order, which is a big incentive component for scientists. A massive hurdle is to translate relatively well and meaningfully our materials into as many world languages as possible to collect those diverse samples. This is not a simple process. It involves translation, back translation, and then checking for consistency and correction of any inconsistency or errors. And it often takes months to translate our materials. And even once we've done that, it's relatively difficult, actually, to be confident that you've translated materials in a way that is psychologically equivalent, that you're actually measuring the same construct. So if you ask somebody to rate a face in a perception study on aggression, you need to make sure that your prompt about rating aggression doesn't just linguistically translate using the word for aggression in another language, but that actually it's eliciting the same psychological state or concept for folks when they're making that judgment or perception. And then we have to get IRB approval everywhere. That's also another big problem. Anyway, that students included who have conducted your own studies, you know that can be a bit of a headache and can take some time. Well, we end up, and the PSA ends up doing that on a massive scale. Studies are pre-registered, then data is collected, and then you need to get hundreds of people on the same page to finish up a paper, to put the discussion section on a registered report if we've gone that route. And that can be quite a messy process. Our Google Docs get really crazy. You guys have worked on group papers, I'm sure, with a few co-authors, and it can be interesting and contentious. Well, it's really fun when there's 600 people in the Google Doc. So there's a lot of fun chaos, I guess I'd say. Okay, that's kind of a quick overview of how PSA studies are actually conducted. I thought it'd be more fun to do a lightning round of an actual PSA study. So instead of me talking in vague terms about what the PSA has done and will continue to do, let's walk through an example. It was our first ever study, and one that I was kind of most involved in when I was still directing the network. Okay, so it was a face perception study, as I just alluded to, with judging faces in terms of aggression. And it was a truly global study. So it was an attempt to essentially test the robustness or do kind of a replication and generalization test of this really highly cited and influential paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Osterhoff and Todorov in 2008. That basically said, when we're looking at faces, and these are some morphs from some of their studies that I just think are kind of entertaining, but the model suggests that when we look at people's perceptions of faces on a whole number of traits, here they are. So you look at a face and you can rate it in terms of how, so these faces or the Lego faces, whatever example you want to use, how attractive, weird, mean, trustworthy, aggressive, caring, emotional, unhappy, responsible, sociable, dominant, confident, and intelligent are they? That if we take those ratings and essentially do some factor analysis to see what the kind of driving components are, that there are two main components that predict, drive, or are the organizational structure of our social perceptions from the face. And those two elements are valence and dominance, hence the valence dominance model. You could think of it as like a positivity negativity or really high correlation with trustworthy or untrustworthy is valence. And then dominance is like the aggression side or the ability to do harm essentially. But that these other traits are kind of a mix of those ingredients, basically, that those are the dominant factors or forces that drive our face perception. That's the original finding from Osterhoff and Todorov, and that's what we tried to replicate. So we got a large set of diverse faces from the Chicago Face Database. So we expanded the stimuli from the original study to be more diverse and representative of humanity. Not perfectly so, but more so. Then we translated all those traits, like I was just saying, into dozens of world languages and back translated them and looked for consistency to proceed with confidence that we were measuring the same thing. And then we collected data from thousands of participants at hundreds of sites. And here is one in, I believe this is Turkish. I picked a Turkish example. Here's one of the stimulus faces. And oh my gosh, I can't even remember what trait this is because it's in Turkish. I wanted to use a different language because I thought that would be cool to kind of show and represent that. And people would go through trial after trial after trial on a single trait. And we got tons of data on each trait on each face in many world regions. In the end, what we do with these studies, we collect these diverse samples, and then we want to see if we're finding something similar to the original, if we're doing a replication attempt, or if we're finding consistent findings across world region. So in this study, just logistically, we were able to get adequate data for analyses in 11 world regions as defined by the World Health Organization. So we used this external body to define some key world regions. And this study turned out really interesting in terms of replication results. When we used the absolute original analysis from the original paper, which was one of the analyses that we pre-registered, we used this little replication metric to see if those two factors were really emerging in the same way as they did in the original. And you can see that our little replication index was, I guess, what you'd call successful in a majority of world regions. So only Eastern Europe and the Middle East are kind of checked as a no there. However, we had a bunch of methodological feedback and peer review on this project before we conducted it. And there was a pretty strong consensus that the more reasonable way to analyze these data was to use a different type of factor analysis, an exploratory approach. So when we actually used the more kind of current best practice analysis, which was also pre-registered in the study that we were going to report both, what you can see is that the picture is quite a bit different if we just look at this replication index. So it's kind of cool on a whole bunch of dimensions for the first PSA study, for the first kind of big global study with thousands of participants all over the world, in that we got this mixed bag. We got this study where the original was somewhat supported and replicated, but we also learned quite a bit of nuance and found that these kind of analytical decisions that you make at the design phase have pretty serious implications for kind of the headline, was something successfully replicated or not. So we found out things are a bit messier and more complicated and maybe not as straightforward as we thought in the original paper. That's a little bit tough to summarize in just kind of a press release or a snazzy headline, but It's the truth, and it's important, and it's interesting, and researchers can kind of dig into that. Interestingly, we shared the data openly from this project, and there have been several follow-up publications of people conducting their own reanalyses or answering their own kind of interesting social perception questions out of those data sets. So that's been really fun to see. Okay, then like I was saying, you have to sort out authorship on these projects. So here's just a look from that study. Here's the hundreds of people. I'm in there somewhere. A couple of my students are, maybe even other people on this call are on the list. Of course, I can't keep track of who contributes from every site. So that's kind of been a fun part of it. Sorry about that. And what we do to try to properly credit and incentivize folks is we use this taxonomy that was originally started by a team of biologists. So you've got all these hundreds of people. Okay, we're all on an author list. Most of us are just in the ... on an APA style citation. Well, there's this cool taxonomy called the credit taxonomy where you can check off for each person what kind of facets of an experiment they contributed to, and whether they were a lead contributor or just kind of a moderate contributor or not at all in an area. So only a few people, of course, came up with the idea. They would get a check there. Some people curated data, check, analysis. And there's 14 of these credit taxonomy categories. And so what the PSA has been doing is taking the authorship lists and breaking them out by people's contributions across these categories. So you can look and see what each person did. And you can say, oh, cool, they contributed in these 3 ways. And these other people contributed in these 7 ways. So the one on the viewer's left is just kind of a nice example that I took from some people working on the credit initiative, where you can kind of see people shaded in a certain category. The one on the right, if you have the high quality version of the image, this is from the actual first PSA study. So you've got these hundreds of co-authors, and then you can see in dark and light blue their contributions. So perhaps not surprisingly, our first couple of authors, you see these lead contributions in a lot of categories. And then as you go down, and then eventually I'm down here somewhere, it's spottier and people just contribute in small ways. But the basic idea is that if you have these massive teams, you need to clarify what people did so that they can put it appropriately on their CV or resume and get the appropriate amount, style, and kind of level of credit for their work. We also kind of got to do a really cool, we call it a COVID rapid study. So the PSA led an initiative to test some brief cognitive reappraisal work during the pandemic. Kind of like basically last year was the kind of main conduct and reporting period for this. And I just wanted to show it as another example of how a large network like this can kind of mobilize really quickly, collect data from 21,000 people, take this cognitive reappraisal intervention and test it around the world rapidly. It was just an amazing kind of thing. At this point, I was kind of just an observer for this project. But I just wanted to share another example of the kind of work that the PSA can do with this large team. And basically, the study found that the cognitive reappraisal intervention was effective in helping people moderate their negative and increase their positive emotions around the pandemic, but it also didn't lessen kind of behavioral responses or health behaviors. Okay, cool. So I'm going to try to wrap up because I want to hear some student questions. I think we got like 17 minutes before the next talk, and probably there's some transition period. So when you think about the PSA, and I'm no longer the director, so I can speak a little bit more like, I don't know, fairly and openly about it or something. I feel a little less invested. There are some costs. People give up individual control. The projects are kind of messy and at times contentious. They maybe run counter to traditional systems where you need to get your own kind of high profile, flashy papers. And the PSA is largely focused on what you might call like easy studies or a little more like point and click psychology that you can administer online or on a laptop. But there are some huge benefits. It can help with replicability. You've got like massive data sets and some replication site by site built in. Might be able to help with the weird samples problem. For me, at a small institution without much research funding, it's been an amazing way to get plugged into big, important projects that I otherwise don't have the means to conduct on my own. Since I don't have many research resources or grad students or high-profile collaborators. And I've just gotten amazing exposure to all these smart collaborators. So it's a really cool kind of way to jump into these big projects. But it comes with its challenges as well. Okay, a couple cool things about the future. This gentleman is Nicholas Coles. He's the current director. I'm super excited. I see he actually placed this little sweet baby raise there at a recent conference. I stole this from his own Twitter page. I guess that was a nod to Zuckerberg. I didn't notice that until today. But he's taken over the helm of the PSA, so it's in amazing hands, and I get to kind of sit back and watch it. But I am involved in a cool grant project. The PSA finally got its first kind of large-scale funding. So we got roughly $1 million from the John Templeton Foundation that I and others in the PSA and under Nicholas's leadership are going to get to conduct even bigger and now kind of better funded studies. So we're really excited about some of our future possibilities because of that. Okay, cool. That's all I've got. I wanted to give a little shout out to all my students. They have been my main supporters and kind of were the first champions and fans of the PSA idea, and they jump in and contribute to all these studies that we conduct. So I wanted to give them a little shout out. There's the whole team. Cool. Thank you. That's my prepared remarks. I would love to field some questions before we go into transition into the next talk mode, and it seems like we probably have adequate time to do that.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Chris. We do have a question from Will. So, he prefaces the question with he's not a student of psychology, although I know he's taken some psychology classes. He's got a degree in philosophy with a minor in sociology. But he did do a project where he had an experimental philosophy study where he looked at a survey of participants' feelings on evil and God, and also a qualitative survey of activists for a sociology project. So he was wondering if you were aware of academics in these or other social sciences who have also raised similar concerns about things like study accuracy, and if there's data on studies in these fields, or if the PSA would be open to working with folks from those fields.
Yeah, I
so
can
kind
answer,
of a multi-part question there.
I can respond to a few of those elements. I have some adequate responses to some of these and some not complete responses. Great question. I appreciate it. The first answer is that I do know that there was a concerted and organized effort to estimate the reproducibility of experimental philosophy. I cannot tell you with confidence what like the headline news from that effort was. Although typically when I see these things, usually the replication rate is not like hugely different from what we see in psychological science. So I kind of have to punt on that one. Sorry, William, but I'm at least suggesting that you or I could do a little more research and track down those results. Because I remember there was a social science team that was doing specifically experimental philosophy replication work. The second component really actually dovetails with my last little hopeful note about the Templeton funding. The Templeton Foundation is really interested in these kind of issues of religious cognition, spirituality, what they call kind of the big questions of humanity. So the studies that are directly funded by Templeton, there would be a lot of support for those studies in those interest areas. So within the PSA, there are mechanisms to study some of those questions and test replication rates on some of those studies. But I do also know there's a concerted effort within that kind of neighboring field to do similar work. So it's not just that this is only kind of a emerging theme in psychological science. But yeah, great questions. Excellent. How do you ensure congruent, accurate, and credible data collection and reporting? Kristen, that is an excellent question. Congruent, accurate, and credible. One of the main kind of mechanisms for that, especially when we have data collection that's in lab or kind of has more moving pieces in PSA studies, the leadership team will create kind of example demonstration videos of data collection sessions. And then individual laboratories will upload their own demo sessions to demonstrate that they are conducting the study with high enough fidelity to the original or the intended method. So even in the face perception study, when people are just kind of clicking at a laptop, each lab uploaded and had kind of checked and green lighted a little demo session of, okay, a participant will come in, here's where they're going to sit, and kind of demonstrating that they go through the same protocol. So that that essentially is the way that the PSA handles congruent data collection. In terms of accurate and credible data reporting, typically on PSA studies, there will be a centralized data collection link. And so data goes to a central repository to essentially kind of build in the prevention of any kind of altering or fraudulent data entry. So hopefully that kind of answers, those are great questions. And I don't know that they're ones that the PSA has perfectly handled. Oh, you're welcome. Oh, Zachary, great question. What does undergraduate student involvement in these projects typically look like? I can answer that in two ways. One is from my own personal experience, because I was the founder and past director, but I also am just the lab. Like I'm a member lab in the PSA here at Ashland. So in my lab, these are perfect undergraduate projects because there's an array of them. So there's a handful, they're in different topics. So I'm a social psychologist, but my cognitive interested students, I can connect them to cognitive flavored PSA studies. And the materials are kind of ready-made, they're ready to go. Undergrads can collect data without designing things from the ground up, and they can contribute in multiple categories and earn authorship. I think that's generally true of a lot of institutions that have researchers that are members of the PSA. I think we get quite a few of these teams where it's like a faculty lead researcher and maybe a couple undergraduate students will join a project together. And that's a cool opportunity for them to kind of see best practices in psychological research and contribute to these larger projects. So I don't know that we've ever like coded authorship for career stage on a PSA study, which would be really interesting to do. But my sense is there's probably a pretty heavy ratio of undergrads relative to the larger published literature, because they're really good projects for students to jump right in and start helping to collect data since they're designed and kind of they've already been vetted, I suppose. Great question. Dr. Stelton-Pohl, is that similar at your institution or? Yeah.
We've had undergrads here at USI get involved. We had Julie, and she even ended up spearheading that book chapter on clinical questionable research practices in clinical psychology. And we've had a couple other students help specifically with the Collaborative Replication Education Project, or CRAPE, throughout that to help with selecting studies and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different ways I'd say that undergrads can get involved. I was wondering, what would you say like one of the hardest lessons to learn as director of the PSA was? Throwing the softball your way.
I don't think that's a softball. That's well, the first kind of mechanical lesson is that you can have this idea and you can see it kind of starting to build momentum, and like there's this awesome power of so many people getting involved. But like one of the hard lessons was that also comes with a lot of like effort, friction, coordination loss. I guess I underestimated just how difficult each step in a study process would be. I kind of always thought, oh, many hands will make light the work, in the sense that like everyone will jump in, and that is the case. Everybody jumps in and contributes. I've been surprised just how much coordination, labor, and effort there is to kind of organize the team. So that's been kind of a hard lesson for me in the PSA. Yeah, but the coolest thing to learn is that like so many people get involved and take on leadership roles. It's amazing to be able to step away from something for a week, a month, a year, forever, whatever the case may be, and the thing just keeps on cranking. It just keeps on doing good, productive work. And then, so what that allows people to do is go on leave, and these projects maintain their momentum. So that's kind of the optimistic version. Yeah, good one.
I was gonna follow up with like what the coolest lesson would be. So
It's just
I wasn't
like
gonna leave you
the
hanging.
enthusiasm, like the global enthusiasm, the amount of people that are so energetically motivated to get involved and pitch in has been amazing. I mean, well, here I am talking to folks at another university that I wouldn't be connected to without the PSA. So that's been really fun.
Awesome.
Yeah.
If folks have any other questions, they're welcome to ask them. We've got a few minutes before. Oh, we do have a question. Has COVID affected anything? They know that you mentioned there were some studies, but
Oh,
has it changed anything with how your the PSA does its job?
yeah, absolutely. Some studies were just kind of put on hiatus. We have a really cool study we just that some leaders in the PSA have rolled out on stereotype threat among Black college students in the U.S., building on some of Claude Steele's excellent work in that regard. And it was really important that those sessions were in person, the lead team decided. So some of our studies just had to be put on pause for indefinite and long periods of time. And other than that, a lot of our things that kind of could be online just were pushed online. So we were still able to get some studies done that maybe we didn't think that was like perfect or optimal, yet it was still productive. So yeah, I don't know if you meant anything deeper than that. It's kind of, I guess an indirect effect is a lot of folks have been pushed to more remote work, and maybe it helps, like the PSA can just be kind of a more normal part of their work process, because the PSA is this kind of Zoom-based remote collaborative effort. And so more people are just like more comfortable with that, and it's kind of easier to get people together across time zones and locations. So.
All right. Thank you for that. So this wraps up the first presentation. We'll take a few minutes break, and then we will start the next presentation here shortly.